Can freedom's anthem, rising with drums and firecrackers, conceal the sound of a cork being pulled from poisoned glass? Can the 4th of July, the nation's proudest day of liberty, hold its breath long enough to miss the slow unraveling of one man's vengeance? And can silence, carried for decades like a slave's shadow, finally pour itself into wine, red as blood, sweet as judgment? South Carolina, 1852. Beneath banners and brass bands, beneath speeches swelling with words like independence and destiny, there lingered a silence more dangerous than any cannon. For on this day the master raised a goblet to liberty, and Samuel, whose silence had been mistaken for surrender, watched with eyes that had memorized every debt. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. The plantation woke with the groan of timbers and the sigh of heat. Even before the sun had climbed over the pines, the air was already thick, pressing against skin like a hand that would not let go. The cicadas sang their endless hymn, a sound that filled every silence but could not soften it. Houses creaked as though they, too, remembered chains. Fields stretched outward, cane and cotton bending in the wind, though the wind itself was weary. It was Independence Day, but here freedom was a word spoken only by others. In the big house, flags of red, white, and blue hung like false promises against whitewashed wood. In the quarters, cloth rags patched with needle and thread served as banners of another kind, quiet endurance stitched in shadows. Samuel moved through this world with silence as his companion. He carried water pails before dawn, each drop trembling against iron buckets, each footstep measured on soil that bore the imprint of hundreds who had walked before him. His body bore its own ledger, scars notched into his skin, welts faded but never gone, yet he seldom spoke, and when he did, his words were brief, as if even syllables could betray him. The master liked to say Samuel was obedient because he was quiet. He mistook silence for loyalty, patience for peace. But Samuel's silence was not emptiness, it was storage. A chest locked tight, each humiliation folded and placed inside, waiting. The estate itself seemed to share in the charade of freedom. The porches creaked with rocking chairs where white men sipped brandy and spoke of rights. Oak trees spread their arms, moss trailing like funeral cloth, hiding the whispers of what their roots had seen. The kitchen smelled of roasting meat and sweet corn, the air thick with grease and fire, while out back smoke rose from pits where enslaved hands fed wood and bone into flame. The season was summer at its most merciless. Heat poured down like judgment. The fields shimmered and the ground cracked in places where no rain had dared to fall. The enslaved bent their backs beneath that sun, their sweat dripping into earth that never thanked them. The overseer's whip cracked like thunder, a sound that split fear into the day. Samuel's tasks carried him between both worlds, the house and the quarters. He polished silver until his reflection trembled back at him from spoons and goblets. He carried trays of roasted fowl past rooms where men laughed about liberty, even as chains rattled just outside. He mended clothes with needle and thread, the same thread his mother once used to sew a doll for him before she was sold away. Each stitch was a memory, each memory an entry in the ledger. At night, silence thickened, the quarters sank into darkness, broken only by the glow of fireflies and the whisper of crickets. In the distance, the main house flickered with lanterns, shadows moving against curtains as music swelled. Fiddles played, glasses clinked, and Samuel carried in more wine. The bottles gleamed like dark secrets under candlelight. He watched. Always he watched. He noticed which bottle the master favoured, how he swirled the wine in his goblet before speaking, how he demanded more when speeches grew long and the fire of his words needed whetting. Samuel's eyes followed the ritual the way others followed scripture. There was no freedom in the calendar, yet the seasons left their mark. Winter had once crept through with frost that cracked the wood of the quarters, leaving children coughing into rags. Spring had brought blossoms that mocked their chains, with beauty too distant to touch. Some returned with fire, heavy and punishing, while autumn dropped its leaves like promises undone. Samuel carried these seasons in his chest, each one another page in the ledger. He thought of family, his father beaten until silence was his only song, his sister sold to a far market, her face now only a shadow in his dreams, his mother's voice soft and steady, reminding him in whispers that patience could be sharper than steel. All were debts, all were written into him. Even the walls kept memory. The wood of the big house swelled with summer heat and shrank with winter cold, groaning as though it carried guilt. The floors complained under the master's boots, echoing each step as if the house itself was weary of holding him up. Keys jingled on his belt, heavy as chains, yet Samuel never reached for them, not yet. He let silence hold them. On that plantation, freedom was a celebration for some and an echo for others. Fireworks were being prepared for the night, powder packed into shells that would bloom in the sky. Children of the house would gasp and clap as colours rained down. Samuel and the others would stand in the fields, watching from shadows, eyes reflecting the brief fire in the heavens. A sky that burned with liberty then went dark again. But Samuel had begun to think of a different kind of fire, not the one that bloomed in the air, not the one fed by powder and spectacle, a fire that lived in silence, a fire that could travel through a goblet, through a swallow, through the body of a man who believed himself untouchable. He waited, moving through days like a ghost no one feared. Each task he performed with precision, each silence was a step toward the inevitable, and though the master never saw it, the house did. The floorboards, the silver, the bottles, all bore witness. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, because silence is never empty. Silence is a vessel. And Samuel's silence was filling fast. Samuel's body was a book no one read aloud, but every page had been written by another man's hand. The lash had left its script across his back, jagged letters carved in flesh. Chains had written their circles into his ankles. The sun had scorched his skin until it bore the shade of earth itself, and yet it was his silence that told the longest story. He carried silence like a cloak, not submission, not emptiness, silence as survival. In silence he could listen, in silence he could remember, and in silence he wrote his ledger of pain. The ledger had no ink, it lived in the fibres of his mind, in scars that pulsed when the nights turned cold, in the hollow of his stomach when rations were cut, in the tremor of his hands when he carried silver goblets meant for others. Every humiliation was an entry, every stolen life became a number on the debt. He remembered the first entry, though he had been a boy then. His father's blood on the dust, a punishment for speaking too loudly, for daring to answer back. Samuel was made to watch. He had wanted to cry out, to scream, but his mother's hand pressed against his shoulder and her voice, low and steady, whispered, "Hold your tongue, silence is stronger than tears." That day, silence became his weapon. That day he began his ledger. The second entry came with the sale of his sister, Ruth. She was younger than him, her hair tied in small braids, her smile still belonging to childhood. She had been taken in the morning, her cries stretching across the fields as she clutched their mother's skirt. Samuel stood frozen, his fists clenched, the overseer's hand gripping fish from water. He never saw her again. In the ledger, she was not only a number but a wound that never healed. The third entry was his mother herself. Not her death, though death eventually came, but the silence she was forced into. He remembered nights when she hummed hymns beneath her breath, old African melodies braided with scripture, her voice soft as water. Then came the nights when her voice was gone, beaten from her until even songs turned to ashes. Samuel remembered lying beside her, hearing only her breath, shallow and weak. She told him then, "We wait, we endure, but one day even silence will speak." Those words lived in his bones like prophecy. As years turned, the ledger filled. Each lash, each insult, each hour of back bent in the sun while freedom was toasted in the house above. It all was tallied. He never forgot the times the master laughed, boasting of liberty while Manuel poured his wine. He never forgot the sting of being called boy, though manhood had already carved itself into his shoulders. He never forgot the taste of hunger, when scraps tossed his way were not enough for the body that worked from dawn. But Samuel's ledger was not only filled with pain, it held memory too, memory of those who had endured before him, whose silence had built the path he walked. He remembered an old man named Josiah, bent and grey, who whispered lessons in the fields. Every lash you take, remember it. Every night you spend in chains, remember it. One day the remembering would rise. Josiah had died with those words, but Samuel had written them into his ledger. In silence, Samuel stored not only what was taken, but what remained. The look in another's eyes when they shared bread in the dark, the whispered prayers around a dying fire, the small victories, a child learning to walk, a mother's hand squeezing her son's shoulder in secret encouragement. These too were entries in the ledger, not debts, but reminders that the book of life was not wholly owned by the master. The master, drunk on his own liberty, never once saw the ledger being written. To him, Samuel was a shadow, useful for work, quiet enough to be ignored. But shadows lengthen, and silence gathers weight. At night, Samuel would sit outside the quarters, staring at the stars. The ledger whispered to him beneath the constellations. The sky seemed vast, eternal, yet even the stars bore scars of fire. He imagined each entry in his ledger as a wound of light in the darkness. His father's blood, Ruth's cries, his mother's silence, Josiah's whispers. One by one, he began to dream differently. The dreams were not of escape nor of running to freedom. They were of balance, of scales tipping. He saw the master lifting a goblet, the wine dark as blood, and he saw the silence finally speak. He did not dream of weapons that clanged and shouted. He dreamed of something quieter, more patient. Like him, poison perhaps, a whisper in liquid form, a silence that killed. The ledger gave him patience. Every time he was struck, he thought, another entry, another number. Every time he watched the master boast of freedom, he thought, the debt grows. Patience was no longer submission, it was interest. The longer the debt remained unpaid, the greater the reckoning would be. Even the house seemed to sense the ledger. The walls moaned in the night as if they had kept secrets too long. The silver he polished reflected not only his face, but the weight of unspoken judgment. The bottles of wine gleamed like pages waiting to be written upon. Samuel carried the ledger in silence, but it was never heavy. It gave him strength. It told him he was not alone. Every scar was a line written by others, but every silence was his own reply. He was the keeper of accounts, and one day the balance would be settled. There were moments when fear clawed at him. Could silence truly strike? Could one man, bound in chains, alter the course of those who believed themselves eternal? But then he would recall his mother's voice. Even silence will speak, and he knew the ledger would not remain unfinished. Independence Day was drawing near again. He watched preparations with careful eyes. The master spoke of liberty, of rights, of destiny. Samuel poured his wine, polishing goblets until they shone like mirrors. In their reflection he saw not himself, but the weight of generations. He saw his father's blood, Ruth's cries, his mother's silence. He saw the ledger nearly full. Silence had been his shield, his storage, his scripture. Now it was becoming something else. It was becoming a blade sharper than steel, more patient than fire, a blade written in patience, sharpened by memory, guided by the ledger of pain. And soon, very soon, it would cut. The days leading to Independence Day unfolded with a deceptive ease, like fabric stretched too tightly, hiding the threads about to snap. To the master it was a time of festivity. To Samuel it was a time of reckoning. Every step he took, every item he touched, became part of a ritual known only to him. Silence was his scripture, patience his liturgy, and vengeance his approaching sacrament. He began in the kitchen. The kitchen was the beating heart of the house, always alive with fire, with knives against wood, with the clatter of iron pots. Samuel's hands moved among these things with quiet familiarity. To others he seemed the obedient servant, polishing spoons, sharpening knives, arranging jars. But to Samuel each object whispered a darker possibility. He handled the knives with care, running his finger lightly across the edge, noting how a single stroke could end breath. Yet knives spoke too loudly, they screamed, they left bodies that others could not ignore. Knives, he thought, were not the voice of silence. He watched the fire. The hearth roared with heat, embers glowing like eyes half closed in judgment. Fire could consume, fire could erase, fire could purify. But fire spread wild, uncontrollable, burning more than the guilty. Fire was hunger, not patience. Fire betrayed silence. His eyes shifted to smaller things, needles, fine and slender, piercing cloth. They reminded him of his mother's hands, stitching dolls from scraps for Ruth, mending torn trousers in the dim light. Needles were silent, hidden. They carried thread, weaving memory into fabric. Samuel touched them, let their points rest against his calloused fingertips. Yes, he thought, the small things endure, the small things pierce unseeing. Then there was the thread itself, thin, fragile, easily broken, yet wound tight, it could bind. It could fasten wounds closed or strangle a breath. Thread reminded him of the web of silence he had carried all his life, delicate but unyielding. He coiled it, tested its strength. He placed it back in its box. Perhaps, he thought, silence is not only wound, but we. But it was the bottles that held him longest. Wine bottles lined the shelves like sentinels, their glass dark and heavy, their contents hidden. He polished them as he always did, holding them to the light, watching the liquid inside shift and shimmer. Wine was celebration, wine was the master's joy, his pride at table, his boast when he spoke of liberty, and wine was swallowed without suspicion. The thought coiled inside him like smoke. Wine could carry silence into the body itself. Wine could carry memory, debt, vengeance. Wine could speak in the bloodstream. But it would need a voice, something unseen, something that slid into liquid and dissolved without trace. Samuel remembered whispers, old tales spoken low in the quarters, when the night was thick and overseers slept, tales of roots that numbed the tongue, of leaves that slowed the heart, of powders mixed into stew that left men pale and breathless. He remembered an elder once speak of berries so bitter they killed pigs that ate them. He remembered how Josiah spoke of certain seeds ground fine, hidden in tea, undetectable until the body convulsed. The land itself, Samuel knew, carried judgment. What grew in its soil was not only life, it was death waiting to be chosen. In the evenings, when his tasks were done and eyes no longer watched, Samuel walked the edges of the fields. He bent low to the earth, studied weeds, pulled roots. He moved with caution, for even silence had to be careful. Each plant he plucked he studied in the dim light, rubbing leaves between his fingers, bringing them to his nose, remembering the whispers. He gathered slowly, a root here, a seed there. He ground them in secret with a stone, his hands steady, his breath quiet. He mixed powders, tested their bitterness on his tongue, spitting them into dirt. He waited, watched animals sniff what he left behind, saw one collapse in stillness by morning. The ledger approved. The earth had given its answer. The plan unfolded not in haste but in ritual. Samuel treated it as one treats the burial of the dead, slow, solemn, inevitable. He cleaned the goblets more carefully than usual. He polished until they gleamed, until they reflected not only his face but his silence. He noted which goblet the master favoured, the one with a faint chip along the rim, the one he always reached for by habit. Samuel's eyes lingered on it as though it were a chalice in a church, destined for a sacred moment. He prepared the powder, fine as dust, bitter as grief. He hid it in a pouch sewn into the lining of his trousers, stitched with the same thread that once bound his childhood doll, thread that carried memory, thread that tied past to present. Every night he rehearsed in silence. He imagined pouring the wine, his hands steady, the goblet filling, the powder dissolving. He imagined the master lifting it, speaking of liberty, toasting the nation. He imagined the swallow, the silence that followed, the cough that broke speeches, the colour draining from his face. He imagined the house pausing, the air itself gasping. He prayed, not to the master's God, but to the silence that had carried him, the silence that promised one day it would speak. Independence Day came closer. The house grew louder, filled with visitors, with laughter, with the rustle of silk dresses and the scrape of boots across polished wood. The kitchen swelled with smells of roasted meats, pies cooling, corn boiled in vats. The enslaved moved like shadows, silent, swift, unseen, carrying trays, carrying burdens. Samuel carried his silence among them. None suspected, none knew. The ledger was his alone. On the morning of July 4th, the sky broke with heat. Cannons fired in salute from the town beyond. Firecrackers snapped like whips in the distance. Flags draped from porches flapping in the heavy air. The master dressed in fine coat and waistcoat, his boots polished, his voice already swilling with the words he would deliver. He spoke of liberty, of revolution, of the blood spilled for freedom. He did not hear the silence that moved beside him, a silence heavier than cannon fire. In the kitchen, Samuel touched the bottles. His hand lingered on the cork of the favoured one. He placed the powder in his palm, breathed once, steady, then poured it in. The liquid swirled, accepted the gift, and returned to stillness. He recorked it, smoothed it, placed it back among its brothers. No one noticed, no one ever noticed silence. As the afternoon swelled, guests filled the house. The table groaned with food, candles flickered though the sun still blazed outside, glasses waited. The master stood tall, the goblet in his hand, ready to speak. Samuel moved behind him, a shadow with steady hands, a keeper of accounts, a ledger about to be closed. The preparation was complete, the silence had been sharpened, the debt was ready to be collected. And all that remained was the moment when the master raised his goblet to liberty. The house pulsed with sound. Fiddles scraped out their frantic songs, boots stamped against the wooden floorboards, glasses clinked as guests toasted freedom. Outside, fireworks cracked like gunfire in the distance, and children shrieked with delight beneath the banners of red, white, and blue, but inside Samuel's chest, silence ruled, a silence heavy as stone, patient as earth. He stood near the table, shoulders straight, hands steady, a servant in plain sight. To those gathered he was invisible. The guests spoke loudly, laughing about liberty, boasting about battles long won. Their words rang hollow, bouncing against the walls of a house that had seen more chains than flags. The master commanded the room, his voice rose above the others, swollen with pride, rich with brandy. He had chosen his favoured goblet, the one with the faint chip along the rim. He lifted it as though it were a crown, his hand broad, his rings glinting under candlelight. "Tonight," the master declared, "we drink to independence, to freedom, to destiny. The guests roared their approval, glasses raised, their faces flushed. None saw Samuel's eyes fix on the goblet. None noticed how he watched each tilt of the master's wrist, each ripple of wine catching the flame of the candles. The poison swirled unseen, dissolved into the master's celebration. Silence had found its voice. Samuel moved quietly through the room, pouring for others, refilling plates, slipping into the rhythm of service. His expression betrayed nothing, but his heart counted the seconds, each tick of time a hammer against the ledger's page. The master raised the goblet higher. His voice broke into laughter, and the others joined. Then he drank. It was a long swallow, the kind of drink meant to impress, meant to show abundance. Red wine slid past his lips, down his throat, carrying with it the powder Samuel had ground in silence. He smacked his lips, satisfied, and laughed again, slamming the goblet onto the table. The room erupted in cheer, fiddles screeched faster, men shouted, women clapped, but beneath the noise the silence stirred. At first it was small, a cough, sudden and sharp. The master waved a hand, dismissing it, laughing through it. He lifted the goblet again, took another drink, forced a grin. Then came the second cough, harder. He reached for his throat, his laughter faltering. The room paused, briefly uncertain. A woman's fan stopped mid-sweep, a man's fork froze halfway to his mouth. The master tried to speak, his words broke into a ragged gasp, his face flushed, deep red, then pale. The goblet slipped from his grip, tumbling, spilling red across the white tablecloth. It spread like blood, slow and deliberate, seeping into linen. The guests stood in confusion. A murmur rippled through them. "What's wrong?" someone asked. "Fetch water," another shouted. But no one moved quickly. Fear had entered the room, quiet and cold. The master staggered back from the table, clutching his chest. His voice, once booming with liberty, was reduced to choking silence. His knees buckled. The house groaned under the sudden weight of stillness. Samuel stood a few paces behind him, hands folded neatly, eyes calm. To the guests he was only a servant watching in horror, indistinguishable from the others. But within he was the ledger closing. Every entry, every scar, every humiliation was being paid in full, with each cough, each gasp, each spasm. The master fell. His body struck the floorboards, and the sound echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. The guests cried out, rushing forward, crowding around him. Some shouted for a doctor, others prayed, others backed away as though death itself might spread. The goblet lay shattered, wine pooling on the wood. The candles flickered against the crimson stain, and for a moment it seemed as though the floor itself drank the debt. Samuel knelt, but not in aid. He knelt as witness. His eyes watched the life drain from the man who had called himself master, who had spoken of freedom while holding chains. He watched until the hands stopped clawing, until the chest stopped heaving, until silence returned to its throne. Around him chaos erupted. Servants rushed with water that could not cleanse, cloths that could not heal. Guests cried out, their voices sharp, fearful, broken. The overseer cursed, demanded explanations, struck a boy across the face, though he knew nothing. Women wept, men swore, and still the body lay still, lips stained dark with poisoned wine. The house seemed alive. The walls groaned, the windows rattled with the fireworks outside, the floorboards hummed under the weight of panic. The very air seemed to say, "I have seen, I have borne witness." Samuel rose slowly. He blended into the shadows, his face unreadable. To the others he was simply one more servant stunned by what had happened. But within, the silence thundered. It was no longer storage, it was no longer patience. It had spoken, it had struck. The master who had mistaken silence for obedience now lay silent himself. Outside, fireworks exploded in the sky, red and white blooms shattering against the night. The guests turned their faces toward the windows, their cries mingling with the sounds of celebration from the town beyond. Liberty roared in the heavens, while death lay sprawled on the floor. No one looked at Samuel. No one saw the steadiness of his breath, the calm in his hands. He slipped away to the kitchen, to the shadows, to the places where silence lived. The goblet remained broken, the stains spread wider. Whispers began to ripple. It was sudden, so sudden. His heart too much wine. The heat of the day, the drink, the strain of speeches. The exclamations tangled themselves into knots, desperate to cover the truth. But silence does not lie. Silence lingers. And Samuel knew that silence would follow them all, through the night, through the rumours, through the legends that would grow. The poison had been swallowed, but the silence remained, echoing in the house, seeping into the walls, waiting to be told as story, as myth, as warning. The body lay where it had fallen, stiffening against the boards of the great house. Candles sputtered in the draught as though they too trembled at the scene. The goblet's fragments glimmered faintly in the pool of wine, like scattered teeth, yet already the house had begun its desperate rewriting of events. "He drank too much," one voice said. "The heat was too strong," insisted another. His heart. It was bound to happen. The explanations piled quickly, frantic scaffolds erected around a truth no one dared touch. No one spoke of poison, no one spoke of vengeance, for to do so would mean admitting that silence could rise, that chains could strike without sound, and so they filled the air with excuses, each weaker than the last. But silence lingered. The enslaved stood at the edges of the chaos, their eyes downcast, their faces unreadable. They fetched water, fetched cloths, fetched whatever was demanded of them, but in their stillness lay a deeper knowledge. They knew what others would not say. They saw the ledger written across the master's final gasp, and though none whispered it aloud, the truth passed among them like smoke, invisible but everywhere. By morning the story had already shifted. The town heard of it in fragments, that the master had been struck by apoplexy, that the wine was too strong, that freedom's celebration had demanded too much of him. The local paper printed a small column, tucked between notices of runaway slaves and advertisements for auctions. It spoke of a sudden and tragic passing, a reminder of life's fragility, no mention of silence, no mention of debt. Yet in the quarters the whispers grew. They did not call it death by chance. They called it balance. They called it the ledger closing. They called it silence finally speaking. But they did not speak it loudly. Such words carried danger. And so the story lived in murmurs, in the still glances exchanged by firelight, in the unspoken understanding that freedom's wine had turned bitter at last. The house itself seemed changed. The walls, once swollen with the master's voice, now groaned under absence. The floorboards carried a stain that scrubbing could not erase, as though wood itself had drunk the truth and refused to release it. Keys hung silent on their pegs, heavy with memory. The air, once thick with speeches, now carried only hush. Visitors came and went in the following days. Ministers prayed, neighbours offered condolences, doctors muttered about weak hearts. Yet behind their words lingered unease. For men who prided themselves on control, on mastery, on liberty defined by chains upon others, there was terror in the thought that death could arrive unseen, carried in silence, that perhaps the very wine they drank was no longer safe. Samuel remained untouched. He moved as he always had, his silence mistaken once more for obedience. He polished silver, carried water, mended cloth. His face betrayed nothing, his eyes gave no sign. If suspicion stirred, it withered quickly beneath the weight of denial. No one wished to imagine that the servant they had ignored could wield such power. To imagine it was to confess fragility. And so silence protected him. Silence was his mask, his shield, his cloak. The same silence that had carried his ledger now carried his freedom within chains. But the enslaved remembered. When the quartered sank into darkness, whispers stirred like wind and grass. He drank and he fell, one voice said. The wine turned to poison, another murmured. The ledger closed, someone whispered, and though no name was spoken, every head turned briefly toward Samuel. Yet Samuel said nothing. He neither claimed nor denied. He let the legend form without his hand, for legends once born walk on their own feet. The children carried the whispers further. They repeated fragments in their games, chanting rhymes of wine and silence, inventing endings, their voices carrying truth disguised as play. Elders hushed them, fearful of overseers' ears, but the words had already taken root. Rumour is a kind of fire. It spreads without flame, carried on breath. Soon the nearby plantations heard of the master who fell on Independence Day, struck down by drink or fate. Some said it was his temper, some said his God had judged him, some said the earth itself had risen in protest, and among the enslaved the truer whisper spread that silence had spoken through Samuel, though his name was never uttered aloud. Fear and awe mingled in equal measure. To some, Samuel became a warning, proof that vengeance could kill, but also proof that vengeance carried risk too great to bear. To others he became a kind of shadow hero, a figure who had done what none dared. They looked at him differently, not with open reverence, but with quiet respect, as one who carried something larger than himself. The master's family mourned loudly, with tears and sermons, with proclamations of God's mysterious will. Yet their grief was edged with fear. The goblet had been swept away, but the memory of its fall remained. They avoided speaking of wine at table. They avoided looking too long at the servants who poured it, and in every clink of glass, in every swallow, lingered unease. The plantation changed, not openly, not in its chains or its whips or its laws. Those remained, but beneath, in silence, something shifted. The enslaved moved with a new kind of gravity, their silence now charged with possibility. The overseer's whip cracked, but its echo carried differently, for silence had proven it could wound. And Samuel himself moved as though untouched by the storm. He spoke little, worked as always, lived as though nothing had happened, but inside the ledger had closed. The debt was paid, and though the world might forget, though the papers might rewrite, though the family might disguise, Samuel knew. The silence within him had been fulfilled. Yet silence, once given voice, does not vanish. It echoes. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the wood of the house. Neighbours spoke of strange unease when they visited, of draughts that chilled even in summer heat, of wine that tasted different, though the cask was new. Some said the house itself was haunted, some said, and thus the story grew, fed by whispers, altered by fear, embroidered by memory. It ceased to be a single man's act. It became a tale, a warning, a legend. Time does strange work upon memory. What begins as a moment, sharp and immediate, becomes in the retelling a shadow, then a rumour, then a story too strange to be real, yet too heavy to be denied. Samuel's act was no different. The years wore on, the plantation changed hands, fields were worked by other backs, the great house took new names, but the stain on the floorboards never left, no matter how often it was scrubbed or sanded. Some swore it grew darker in the summer heat, blooming like blood beneath the polish. Others said at night, when the lamps burned low, the wine seemed to glimmer as though freshly spilled. Children, both black and white, whispered the tale when elders were out of earshot. On Independence Day, they would say, the wine turned to poison and freedom turned on itself. They never named Samuel directly, his silence remained. He was the shadow behind the story, the figure who moved without sound, the hand unseen, and in that way he became larger than himself. Among the enslaved, the tale grew into something more sacred. They spoke of the ledger, though never openly, never by firelight where overseers might hear. They spoke of silence as if it were a weapon one could sharpen, a cloak one could wear, a seed one could plant. Samuel was not a man to them any more, but a lesson. Patience can be sharper than steel, silence can carry judgment further than a shout. When freedom finally did come, years later, after war and fire and ruin, the story surfaced again. Old men told it with shaking voices, women braided it into lullabies. Children grew up hearing of the master who drank his liberty and swallowed his end. To some, Samuel was a hero, to others a ghost, but to all he was a reminder that even in the darkest silence, vengeance waits. Travellers swore that if they passed the house on a July night, they could hear glasses clink with no hands to raise them. Some said they smelled wine on the wind, though no vineyard lay nearby. Others claimed to hear a cough echo through the halls, ragged, gasping, never-ending. And there were those who whispered that Samuel himself walked still, not in chains, not in shadow, but in silence, that he could be seen standing at the edge of the fields, back straight, eyes steady, watching, that if one dared to meet his gaze, they would feel their own debts rise up, heavy and undeniable, pressing against their chests like unpaid accounts. The story crossed borders. Preachers used it as sermon, warning of sin hidden in silence. Writers turned it into cautionary tale, twisting it into parable. And yet, in every retelling, the heart of it remained. A master drank to liberty, and silence answered. In the town's graveyard, his tombstone bore the usual words, "Here lies a patriot, a man of honour." But the weeds around it grew thicker than on any other grave, as though earth itself refused to keep him clean. People avoided the stone, crossing themselves as they passed. Mothers told their children not to linger there, and when fireworks lit the sky each Independence Day, some swore the ground near his grave trembled, as if the earth remembered, but the house remembered most. Visitors spoke of draughts that chilled the spine, of floorboards that groaned like voices trying to rise. In the dining room, where the goblet fell, candles guttered unexpectedly, flames choking themselves into smoke. Some guests refused to dine there at all. They said the room was wrong, too heavy, too silent. And Samuel, his name never entered the records. The ledgers of men, those books of ownership and accounts, never wrote him as more than property, never gave him the place he deserved. But the other ledger, the one he carried in his chest, the one silence itself had written. Legends do not need paper. They live in air, in whispers, in the spaces between truth and fear. And so Samuel lived on, not as man, not as slave, not even as murderer, but as silence itself made flesh. Can silence drink, can silence pour itself into goblets, into throats, into history? Perhaps not, but silence can wait. Silence can mark debts. Silence can break when the hour comes, and when it does, even nations built on liberty will hear its voice. And so the story endures. Independence Day comes each year, drums and fireworks filling the sky. Yet beneath the celebration, beneath the noise, beneath the speeches, silence lingers. Somewhere Samuel waits, ledger in hand, reminding the world that debts are never forgotten. For silence does not die. Silence only echoes. And in South Carolina, 1852, silence poured itself into wine and spoke.